as I was looking, I actually had a different lesson I was going to do for today. And yesterday, I had done all this research and everything, and I went, wait, no, this is not going to come across right. It's going to be way too controversial. And so I decided to do the Crusades instead, which is less controversial. But so I put this out, and I thought this was a funny one. It says, it has nothing to do with the Crusades, but there can be no peace until they renounce their rabbit god and accept our duck god. And you notice they have the exact same flag. And they look exactly the same. So I just thought it was kind of funny as a wars about the Crusades. And do you guys remember the, let's see, Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol? And it begins with the phrase, Bob Marley is dead. Is it Bob Marley? That's also the singer, but it's Marley, right? He is dead, unless you understand, or he's dead as a doornail.
The Marleys were dead to begin with.
Yes, they were dead to begin with, and that's you. Unless you understand they're dead, nothing else in the story makes sense. And that's how Charles Dickens begins.
Mama.
Well, to understand how Christianity is, you have to understand. I'm just going to flip this next one. Early Christians were nonviolent. You must understand that early Christians were nonviolent. We don't comprehend this because we live 2,000 years removed and a whole lot of philosophy, a whole lot of reasoning, and a whole lot of history in between us and them. We don't comprehend this. We do not think the same way. I just want to point that out. The early Christian church was non-violent. I don't think people realize how deep this goes. The idea of, you see, just as an example, we just had a police officer in the back. I believe it was a police officer. We have no problem with that. It did not alarm me. The early church would have huge alarms, and they would say, he's going to hell because he uses force or thinks force or is trained in force and violence. That is significant difference. They said a person who uses violence or force is not of God. Very significant. They were non-violent. They took it from Matthew 5:39 as an example. It says, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him also, or the other also. And the logic with this is, if you are Christ's, then you are not your own. You can't be offended if somebody hurts you, or is mean to you, or beats you because they're hurting Christ. Because you're now the slave of Christ. That's a blow against him, not against your honor. You don't need to defend yourself or your honor. That is the logic that they use. That's what most people will say about this passage. Why do you turn the other cheek? Because you are now a slave of Christ. And that is, if they're attacking you for doing what you're supposed to do, then you are, they're attacking Christ, and it's not your offense that you can take. It's not your right to take offense. That is what the early church taught. Now, I'm going to take it back one step here when I go at the beginning. It says, what has God said? This is what everybody believed. I think I just mentioned this, that up until the year 1650 approximately, everybody throughout all history and every culture believed that there's a God. They didn't doubt this. But what they said is, what has God said? Whichever God. What have they said, now we must do? If the God says, you throw your children into the fire, then they threw their children into the fire. If God says, or their God says, whatever they would say, they would do it. Because they have to. Well, that changed. And so when we look back now, we don't understand and comprehend this mindset. If God has spoken, it must happen. We reason things. We rationalize, well, we should obey God. We should do what is right by God. Do we really know, is this the will of God? They would not do that. That is a cultural difference. So they are, this is something that all sociologists and anthropologists and everybody has pointed out. It's a huge shift. This has gone, there's different steps in between to where we're at right now, but it is significant. You have to begin, first, Christianity was nonviolent. Two, people didn't question what God had to say. So as Christians, they didn't question what the Bible said. Nobody sat there with, in 400 AD or 600 AD or 800 AD or up to 1200 or up to 1500 AD. Nobody questioned whether or not God in Genesis 1 created the heavens and the earth. It didn't come up. Nobody questioned whether Jesus came and took away sins or how it happened. It didn't come up. Because even if you were a person who was a difficult, ornery person, you still understood that God created the heavens and the earth. And that is how the world worked. So I pointed out that I have a few people here just to discuss, especially in the first few hundred years. I have Athenagoras here. It says, we Christians cannot endure to see a man being put to death, even justly. You see, as an example, this is how, when talking to Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, Athenagoras describes Christians and how they do not resort to violence in any way. Tertullian says, and he's only without the sword can the Christian wage war. The Lord hath abolished the sword. So talking about violence in any way was not done. Origen says, you cannot demand military service of Christians any more than you can of priests. We do not go forth as soldiers with the emperor, even if he demands this. That they cannot do this. This is one of the main reasons why Constantine would not convert until his last days. People said, well, why did that happen? Because he might have to send soldiers at people. He might have to cause violence towards someone. And if he were to do that as a Christian, he would go to hell. He would forfeit his salvation by going against a very significant tenet of Christianity. But this is the teaching of the church. They were very, very clear on this. All the way up until, look at the date now, we're going all the way up to 1182 and the Franciscans. It says they actually created orders that even orders in the church, they could not have violence or show violence. So they even had this third order created. This is during and after the Crusades started, but they could give conscientious objection to civilians in this third order that they are not to take up lethal weapons or bear them about against anybody. So much so that it had become part of the church, even in the medieval times, that you could have conscientious objectors who would say, I cannot abide by violence. And so the church gave them an out to going on crusades or doing violence. That is how deep this entrenched tradition is. We don't have that anymore. I'm not just saying that because I come from a Mennonite background. That's what alerted me. But if you look at history, this is what you find. So I give the caveat in there right off. Then, somewhere, Augustine came up with this idea. We talked about this a little bit, of the idea of just war theory, which allowed limited defensive violence to protect human lives. Now, what Augustine said is he found out that there was a Roman general who had converted to Christianity. And then barbarians came into the empire and they started attacking some villages that he was responsible to protect along the frontier. And he didn't go out to stop them because he was a Christian. And Augustine chews them out and says, your job is to go and protect people, to stand in front of the violence. Don't worry about their houses, their lands, their money, their stuff. That doesn't matter. but you go out there and protect the people. And this was the first time that you get this change, that there were some people now who are allowed to be violent in any way. And it's in a defensive situation. But we're talking about this progression of now the church can do one thing, but the state is allowed to still function violently in certain circumstances. It had never come up. Yep.
When was Augustine? When is this?
That would be in the 400s.
For?
Yeah, so we're talking about just about the time with the rise, or the 300 to 400, with the rise of Constantine, when there was more Christians who were being saved because Constantine got saved, and the impetus had grown of the number of converts, that they were significant in the empire.
Also historically, right about the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, right before.
Yes, they were starting to have trouble. This is one of the logics that he uses. He says, love does not preclude a benevolent severity, and that the love of enemies admits of no dispensation, that love does not exclude wars of mercy waged by the good. So basically he's saying it's okay to have tough love. If you've got an empire who's really bad and they're doing horrible things, you're allowed, you should stop them. And it is the love of people that causes you to fight that war. You're not doing it out of hate. In fact, many of the early documents, I don't have any of them here, because again I switched. It talks about how a soldier should feel bad doing it. When they go to war, they should feel bad. They should feel sick to their stomach when they go out. And they would talk about that. That if they enjoyed or didn't care, then they shouldn't be doing it because their heart is in the wrong place. Their job, going to war and fighting the battle, defending people, is to feel horrible about what they're about to do and what they've done. Then, later on, this is actually Thomas Aquinas, so it's towards the end of the Crusades. He puts out this, but it's just, he forms a doctrine where the nation states begin to say, well, how do we know when a war is just, when somebody is evil enough for us to attack? And so they came up with these 3 rules. It says, first, the authority of the sovereign, by whose command you have to have a king. You have to have a ruler who has the rightful domain to wage war. Civilians can't wage war because they don't have the right to do so. Secondly, a just cause is required, namely that those who are attacked should be attacked because they deserve it on account of something they've done. So it should be done because of justice. So you have a rightful ruler with justice. And thirdly, it is necessary that the belligerents should have a rightful intention, so that they intend the advancement of good and the avoidance of evil. So they have to feel bad again. You have to feel you're doing good, and you have to you restrain yourself from evil. Now, over the last little while, we've been talking about Roman Catholic tradition. And we talked about ex opere operato. By the doing it is done. And there were 3 things that were required in making something happen. The right person does the right way, and then what they are wanting happens. Look at this. You've got the right leader with the right intention, dealing with something, brings something about that makes it now good. You see the pattern forming of everything that's done in medieval period? As long as you have this right thing in your heart, and you're doing the right thing for the right reasons, and you have the authority to do so, it will turn out good. And so they justify wars because in the doing it is done. You're carrying it out. That is very much the logic, because this is the same guy who comes up with ex operato. He uses the same logic here. Excuse me. And it so permeated the culture of the time that it was okay for rulers to wage war if they felt good about it. that they were doing it for God. They were not. They were contrite in their actions. Now there's another aspect. You've got this nation states and the government working together, that they say if they do something for the right reasons, that they can, it will be blessed. Not because God is blessing it. Sorry, I missed this one step. Not because God is necessarily blessing it, but because the church is God on earth. And the power of God, that is the whole idea of ex opere operato, because God gave them the authority. The emperor gave them the land and the authority and the power, because they have God's authority to do these things. Therefore, it is good if the church says so, because it is God's representative here on earth. So if the church says we should have a holy day on a certain day, well, it is so. It doesn't matter if it's in the Bible or not, because the church has declared it so. And therefore it is God's will. Nobody questions what is God's will. Nobody would, up until the 1650s. So if a church comes up and says, you can't eat meat on Fridays, nobody will. It doesn't matter if it's in the Bible or not. You should fast on Saturday. Nobody will, because you don't question it. You can question the logic and say, does the Bible truly say? But they would still do it. Nobody would. It's just not in their minds to fight that, because that is a concrete fact. At the same time, remember when I talked about a long time ago that about what would happen in the year 1000, that wouldn't all the millennialists, the people who felt that Christ was going to return in the year 1000, wouldn't there be problems with that in the church? And I said, yes, there actually was. Well, at the year 1000, a lot of his theologians were saying Christ is going to return. And they were making a big deal about Christ returning. Remember, all this is kind of coming together. The church having authority, it's at the highest point of its authority. You have a millennial idea of we need to get Christ, or Christ is going to return, and so we have to, the church has to make things ready for Christ's return, because the church is responsible for that. The church makes it happen. God is not going to just do it on his own, because he's given authority to the church. So it is the church's job now to make it Christ's return. Now, how do we have to get Christ to return? That's the question. They have to make everything happen. So then there was this guy, just to show an example. Wouldn't you love having a title venerable? I always think, that's like, his name is Bede. He's a historian, church historian. But now he's known as the Venerable Bede. Everybody, he's just the Venerable Bede. It's the most unique name, I think, in history. I love that name. It just rolls off the tongue, too. Well, he was a historian. And one of the things that he did that's really, that puts him in the books, the history books, is he's the guy who made AD BC, Anno Domini before Christ. He reset history to begin at the birth of Christ. That's kind of his claim to fame. Well, by setting that time, he then started saying, well, Christ is going to return at 1000. So now we're talking about when did the Crusades happen? Well, they started in the year, before it got into the 11s, right? It's still in the reign of 1000s. And because there can be discrepancy about when Christ came, so it kind of makes a little bit of a movement point here. So people were thinking about this. There were lots of sermons being said about Christ returning. It's imminent. It's right now. We need to bring forth the world, or Christ to come into this sinful, fallen world, because we are in trouble. One of the things I did yesterday is I read a bunch of sermons about from the time period, and a theme that was being said over and over was, look how bad our countries are right now. There are robbers in the streets. Our politicians can't be trusted. Does that sound familiar? And I was seeing this over and over. And the people were saying, you came from pagan backgrounds, but you defeated the pagans. And you set up Christian nations. Now go out and clean the streets. That is actually what the sermons were. It's kind of interesting. They were talking about the world is coming because it is so bad right now. And into this, the world is bad. We have perhaps done bad things. Because I've had to go and commit violence to fight off a bandit and also these sort of things. Well, up until this time, then there became this issue. And people say, when did the Crusades begin? Well, it says, these are the arguments that historians would say why the leaders said they had to do the first crusade. I'm going to talk about primarily the first one, and then I'm going to allude to the third and the fifth. Just because they are the ones that were most famous. But the first one here, it was to aid the Byzantines, their brothers, fellow Christians, against the Turks, the Seljuks, or whoever, the Turks. The people who we now call from Turkey.
It's like 1090, is that what we're talking?
Yeah, 1095. So we're talking about 1095 here. But you see, this has all been building. Something doesn't start from nothing. There are certain points in history that you would say, something happened and the people responded. Well, what did they do? Well, I had one historian pointed out, if you go to Italy today, the Italians are not people who says, let's go conquer the Mediterranean. They just don't seem like the people who want to conquer the Mediterranean anymore. It's not in the Italian mindset to go, let's just go on boats and conquer everybody and take over the world. Well, what changed? But there was something that happened, and these people decided to make an impetus. Something happened with the Romans. Well, something happened with the Arabian nations, and they started attacking. And they just kept attacking. And you have these moments in time that are dramatic, and they say, well, why did this happen? Well, the Turks were attacking, and there were, to protect Christians and pilgrims, to stop persecution that was happening in in the Holy Land. And I added this on, like you police your roads, because this was mentioned so often. You go out and you police your roads against bandits. Well, that's happening in the Middle East. Shouldn't you do something about it? And they would make it personal. And then to reclaim Jerusalem, to liberate the holy sites, to speed the return of Christ. Because it is the church that does these things. You've got to make it happen. It's not God willing it, per se. You are the hands and feet of God to do so. Now, I wanted to look in. Now, what were the actual proofs that they're talking about? When the Muslim armies came into Antioch and all the way up into parts that are now Turkey and that area, they did destroy churches. They did, yeah.
Okay, so the Turks, they're in Turkey, but Constantinople's in Turkey.
Yeah, but they're on the other side still. They didn't fall for a while yet.
Okay, so Constantinople is still in power. The Turks are just like halfway into Turkey. And
yeah, the side that's on the other side of the Black Sea and whatever that area is. They're just on the other side. They've been held back because of water. And Constantinople was a huge fortress. I mean, they built those walls, and they are very high, and there were many of them. So there was, as they attacked, they did these things, and everyone knew it. They would get their news reports. They wouldn't get from the news, but there would be the stories that would pass through the campfires. And they would say, yeah, the Turks attacked and they destroyed the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and they destroyed churches. They did bad things. The priests wouldn't allow things to, the worship of Christianity to happen there in many locations. Just think of it if ISIS took over, what would happen?
Yeah, there's slavery as well. Slavery as well. It's the capture of the slave.
Yeah, and these were stories that had been going around now for a while, around the campfires, and so people knew they were going on. So there was persecution against Christians. They did go in. Now, did the Turks go and kill every Christian? No, because they could make more money, because they would extort Christians and Jews, making them pay additional fines. That's part of the Muslim world, is that if you they will kill and enslave tribal peoples, but Christians and Jews are different. They're people of the book. And so they're allowed to extort more taxes from them. And so they don't necessarily mind Christians and Jews as much because they can make more money off of them. And they allow them to exist. That's right in the Quran. That's the same thing that ISIS did, is they would increase taxes upon Christians and Jews in the areas that they had, and they wouldn't just murder them. But then they were actually doing taxes about every 6 weeks. Yeah, like it was a lot. So this is normal. They didn't change their game plan. But think of when the wave came in, these were religious zealots. These were guys like ISIS. And I've censored this because in the sermons that, especially a guy named Robert the Monk, I love that name too, Robert the Monk. He wrote a series of sermons, and he goes through and details the things that happen. Now, there's nothing different in what he says than what you heard in the stories of when ISIS took over. There's nothing different. The beheadings, the torments. It's no different. Nothing changed. When they came in, it was bad. Destroying churches. And I stopped because he actually makes a statement at one point. And he says, at this point, it's better to be silent than to talk. So he left it in the people's minds. Just think of it as a rhetorical tool. Says it's better not to tell you all the things that happened anymore, especially to women. And then he walks away, so people will think about it. It was actually a really good tool that Robert the Monk used as a rhetorical use of it. And then, because the call to the Crusades was in one day, but it was built up in England. It was built up in France over a period of time. It was crafted. There was this ferment of people thinking Christ is going to return. There were problems in society. And then they started saying, well, but look at them in Jerusalem. And building upon this desire. And they said, Christ saved you, but what are you doing for him now? Are you fighting on the bandits in the streets? Well, you should be over there too. And then he told them, if anyone, I think this is from Robert the Monk. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Well, he uses passage. It's from the Bible, right? And that term, take up his cross, means crusader. Cross. Taking up your cross. That's what crusader means. So these people were saying, I choose to do what Christ wants, both here and now over there. I will do what the church tells me to do. And then I have a few more. They're talking about speeding the return of Christ. And these are different. Robert the Monk, the Foucher of Chartres, Gilbert of Nogent, different people who have presented the same idea that what they're doing is speeding up the return of Christ. Let's get this world over with so we can be with Christ in paradise. These people were not looking for political power. They were not looking for money. Historians point out the first crusade was not for money and power. They were doing this because it had been built up and they were doing it as Christian zeal and obedience, not anger, but we need to do this. This is something that the good Christian men need to do, is go over, leave your family. If you're willing to just stay with your family, are you worthy of the call of Christ? Because if you can't leave father and mother and your properties and go serve me, then you're not worthy of being a Christian. This was diligently seeking Christians going out, doing what they had been told to do. This was not zealots who were crazed and angry. And about 100,000 Christians launched towards Jerusalem. Well, I'm just going to flip through because we talked about some of this, the things that were happening. Yeah, worse to be silent. Well, Jerusalem at this time was not Jewish. That's one thing that a lot of people don't think of. It wasn't Jewish. The Jews, after the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 120 AD, Rome took their time killing the Jews. They killed the Jews in Jerusalem. This was long after the temple was destroyed. That was in 70 AD. This is 120 AD. So 50 years later, Rome took their time. They didn't rush in and capture and take the leaders and end the rebellion. They killed the Jews. Exterminated many, many Jews at this time. And so Jerusalem was primarily Christian. Constantine rebuilt it and brought Christians in order to be in Jerusalem. There were very few Muslims at the time because they were just coming in. And when the Muslims took Jerusalem, they didn't kill all the Christians because they could make lots of money off of them. They just took it over, and yeah, Christians died because they were manning the walls and stuff and resistance, but they didn't just kill them all. That has to be pointed out. It was not Jewish. Then the Christians start showing up. Okay. I'm just going back through the same thing. So in 1095, Urban II made his speech and the people went. So the First Crusade from 1096, 1 year later, for 3 years. Then the Third Crusade I'm going to talk about. You notice it's about 50 years later, well 48. And then just after that, a little bit later, the Crusades don't last for a long time. It's about 200-300 years there, where there are Crusades and then counter jihads against them. Back and forth, back and forth. But the first one is different because it was people who were doing their job. They weren't out for money. Okay, well, I'm going to stop here. So the First Crusade, they came in and they conquered Jerusalem. And they killed everybody. They killed the Jews that were there. They killed the Muslims that were there. They killed the Christians that were there. They came in psychotic. These guys were a long ways from home, and it was not a good thing. It was a massacre. This is when when the Muslims talk about Christians and the things that Christians do to Muslims, this is what they're talking about. The fall of Jerusalem in the First Crusade. They say, what will happen if Christians take over a Muslim country? The fall of Jerusalem tells us what they will do. They will kill every man, woman, and child. And the streets will run with your blood because it happened. That happened. And as Christians, when we talk about, going out as evangelism and all that stuff, this is what the Muslims remember. Crusades were not a time in which we built the ramifications in the world, the non-resistance, the love, the moving of the gospel went back a long way in the reputation because of the things that happened. The First Crusade gained the most ground. They created a Crusader state. They conquered Jerusalem because at the time Islam was weak. The leaders were weak. And so they won and they took a whole lot of ground. In the Third Crusade, this is the one that people think of the Crusades. This is the one that people remember with Richard the Lionheart and from the Germany and France, all the kings, King Charles, and I think there was it Charles? I can't remember. But you know, a lot of Robin Hood, all the stories and the mythology that kind of go behind the
King
stories.
Arthur.
Yeah, King Richard, the Lionheart, and all that. These are the ones that went over, and they never took back Jerusalem. And then they left kind of beaten. A lot of people died. A lot of people went back home. But they found out that they can get lots and lots of money out of it. The Crusades started bringing home lots of gold. Lots of, different wealth started coming in. And they began to get politically powerful from it. And so they began to change the mentality. It stopped becoming really anything to do with Christ. And more to do with how do you get your money. Until we got to the 5th Crusade, which now the Crusaders, the people of Venice, realized they could make a ton of money off Crusades. A lot of money, transporting troops all the way down, taking care, feeding, housing them. They started making a lot of money, the people in Venice. And they made a deal with Constantinople saying, hey, how about we take this Crusader army, the 5th one that's going to come, and you march them around, and we'll house them and feed them as they go, all the way to Constantinople, and then you can take that last little jump over into Turkey, the area that over there, just on the other side of Constantinople, and they can attack from there. And they made a deal with the emperor that said, if you take care of these guys and feed and house them, then they'll just walk right through your land. Well, what do you think happened? They showed up, and the emperor was weak because he just finished having a fight with his brother for who was in charge, and he couldn't feed and take care of the entire Crusader army. And so they sacked and destroyed Constantinople. They're Jewish brothers, they're Orthodox brothers. Why do you think the Orthodox people don't trust Westerners in the Western Church? Because they did the exact same thing. They killed every man, woman, and child. This is, I look at this and think, you look at the history and you think, this is the repercussions. Now, I know that we want to talk about, people want to talk about all the different crusades and all they happened and stuff. And we can understand why they did what they did. But this is why the world hates the church. One of the main reasons, besides the doctrines and fighting, wrestling with the philosophies, is because of these two battles. Because of what the Christians did. And it becomes an excuse. You know how, like, if somebody does something bad, and then you can sit there and point out, oh, but that person did something bad too. It now creates something that they can focus on. The Muslims focus on the sack of Jerusalem. The Orthodox hate the West because of the sack of Constantinople. Constantinople never recovered. One of the reasons why I think they fell all the way to the gates of Vienna until the Muslims began to get pushed back, is because the Crusaders sacked it. Came in from the other side and sacked them from the back, basically. This huge fortress. And killed so many people that they didn't have the resources to fight back. So again, I want to point out, yep.
Why do we call it why do we call it Christians rather than the Roman Catholic Church?
Because there's a mix. You know how, like, in the Nicene Creed, or the Athanasian Creed, or the Apostles' Creed, it talks about there is one holy Catholic Church. And the idea is that there is one church. There can never be two churches. You can have a Roman church, Roman Catholic Church, which is an actual political institution. But there are Christians in there. And because they would say, because of this idea that, because God has said, there's one church, even if you find fault in the Roman Catholic Church, they're the only means to salvation. That's what the people in the medieval time would think. You can sit there and argue about doctrine, but at the end of the day, you always do what the church says, because that's what God wills. It's a different way of thinking, and we don't have that mindset. You can find opposition all the way through the medieval church of all sorts of leaders, all sorts of people saying, this is wrong, this doctrine is wrong, this is wrong. But they always pull back to, there is one church. And if a person denies saying that, no, there's not just one church, whether it's visible or invisible and all the argument behind that, you're denying that there is one means of salvation. It's really hard. A lot of Baptists, wrestle with this issue. Because when they start being schismatic and saying, oh, the Roman Catholic Church are not believers, you're saying that the church generally, you're making a definitive argument there where you're saying all people who are like this are not part of the Christian church. Yeah, I know it's very difficult, but
Yeah, I just want to make, because, in history, there's a lot of people look at all these atrocities, wherever that the Roman Catholic Church did, but then when you lump the Roman Catholic Church with, when I look at, say, Christians, I look at, you think Protestants, right? But the thing is, so there's difference between Protestant Christian and Roman Catholic Church, so if you lump the two together, then whatever one side does, the other side is automatically guilty. So I was just saying, I don't
because
know
the
why in
Protestants
history
were
it
very
should,
collective.
I just to me makes it should be a total separate thing, but.
The Protestants were very magisterial as well, especially at the beginning. They had their leaders. That's why you have, Lutherans in Germany, and they were very magisterial as well. That's the term they would use for using the government. They did as well. I just think that the idea is that we can't determine the salvation of people. Is that, especially before 1650, every person, unless they have, if they understand what God is saying, in their time period and in their mindset, they will always do what the church tells them to do. Because God has said. We don't think the same way. But schismatics, you know that all the schismatic groups, I was looking this up, this is one of the things I did, is I was looking up, they all agreed with the Donatists, going right back to the beginning that says that it's okay to break up the church, that we're the only holy true ones and everyone else is bad. That's a danger. That's a real danger when you start saying that you're the only ones. I remember thinking of this with, what was that prophet? In the Old Testament where he says, I'm the only one, and God says, no, there's 10,000 that haven't bowed their knee. Elijah. When people start saying, oh, I'm the only one that serves God, it's very proud. Pride's a sin. That God always has those who have not bowed the knee. And I think it's really hard to sit there and say, even if they were doctrinally had things that we would disagree with, there were an awful lot of people who the Holy Spirit worked with and worked in and within that system. And we have to be careful. There's the visible church and there's those who God has called. And they overlap, and it's really hard to separate the two kingdoms as Augustine would use. I have one question here and I'll go back, okay?
Yeah, there's more, that's a big conversation. but-
I'm just curious, at this time, the Eastern Orthodox had already split from Roman Catholic.
Yep.
And the Eastern Orthodox was centered in Constantinople.
Yep.
So how did they view their Roman Catholic brethren? Did they feel like their brothers in Christ were coming over to help them? And then they got attacked? Like, how did that work?
I think that they were nervous from the beginning. I think they were very nervous because they had just seen the sack of Jerusalem. They had seen that these guys, once you get a bunch of people together, what do they say? People are smart, but a mob is stupid.
Yeah.
And when you get a whole mob of people, when they break in through the walls and they see the wealth of Constantinople, like I think what one of the historians I read said, if you want to see the wealth of Constantinople, you go to Venice. Because they looted, the Venetians don't have an army, but they looted Constantinople, and the pillars and the opulence of Constantine are in Venice. They took it all and put it into the city. Now, you could say whether that was planned from the beginning. That's not written down, but I mean, they knew that the Orthodox were weak. They just lost a whole lot of land, and they had a whole bunch. I think it said there was 9 battles against them that they had lost in a row to the Turks. By the time it got to this point, and then when they came in, they see the weakness and this huge wealth. And these guys, because Urbain II also said that the Crusaders could keep what they took, which added to he actually says that. I didn't put that up there, but he actually said, if you do take something, well, you're allowed to take it from the infidel, because they don't have a right to it in the first place. So who's the infidel? Well, the Orthodox aren't as Roman as we are.
Was there a
Oh.
kind of like recovery or PTSD kind of thing that people had to wrestle through after the Crusades, like psychologically what they had done and the horror of what happened?
I'm not
They-
sure. I know that the Romans had times, they actually said when people went to battle, they had a whole thing, but I don't know if like the Romans actually had a time, they called it after a battle, they would go into camp and the camp would close the doors. And they would have an alone time with just soldiers because they needed to recover, not just physically, but mentally. And bad things would happen. And they closed the doors so nobody would see it for a period of time. I read about that somewhere to deal with that.
So when you talk about the one true church, is that the like ancient belief in talking about like if you are Catholic and you go to the Catholic Church, you will be saved? Where does that fall into like the Protestant Reformation?
Well, the Protestants actually still held, they did not change that view of the church. The Protestants still hold to the one universal church. That's why they just have that little asterisk.
Right.
It says that we believe in one Catholic Church, and they want to say universal versus the Roman Catholic Church. But at that time, they merged a little bit into people's thinking. They started saying they understood there was a visible. Thomas Aquinas talked about this all the time. That he said that there was an invisible and a visible church, and they're not the exact same thing. But God has said, and therefore this church is as close as we can get the representation of Christ. Yeah.
Yes, so much of it depends on how you define words. Like when Jesus talked about the church being the body of Christ, and vice versa, that idea of the church as being believers, those who know the Lord. And, Jesus talked about the parable of the tares sown with the wheat, and you let them grow up, who knows, and then, so there is the church as an earthly institution.
It's like a concept of
Right,
the church.
earthly institution, and now we have multiple earthly institutions, right? But there is the one church, and that when you talk about that one spiritual church, you're talking about people who are true believers. And they are kind of mixed into the different institutions that are also called churches. So that's kind of where the confusion comes in, I think, a little bit, is that. So as the Roman church in particular, as we see them progressing and adding more things to water down or distort the gospel, there's still believers in the midst of that. But the institutional church is beginning to crumble, and that's one of the reasons why for the Reformation to address the crumbling institutional church, even though there were believers at the time, but they were not. They were a minority voice until towards the end, until the Reformation, and you have the pre-reformers and the reformers. So that's kind of maybe where the confusion comes. So at that particular time, like around 1000 AD, you had if you were living in France, if you were going to go to church, there was the church that you would go to. It wasn't all. You would go to the Baptist church, or you would go to the Presbyterian church. You would go to the church in your community, which would be under at that time primarily, unless there was some Orthodox Eastern, it would be the Roman Catholic Church. So, and that then changed later on, and there were going to be people in that who were probably believers in your local community, and many who were not because of the fact of the watering down and the adding to the gospel that was happening through the years. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
This was actually one of the topics I was trying to avoid today, that I said that I wasn't going to bring up, was actually had to do with the unity of the church idea. I thought it might cause, if I get into it, it would be kind of, it's an issue that a lot, especially Baptists, don't always talk about.
Yeah, so if you talk about the church in that time, if you're talking about the church in 600 or 800, it's the earthly church at that time in Europe was the Roman Church.
Yeah.
So that didn't change until you had pre-reformers in England like Knox, and then Luther and during the Reformation. Then you had what was sprung up out of England, is the Church of England, right? And then after that, there was then more of the local church became a popular idea, but still, even believers today, if you know Jesus as a Savior, whether you're part of a Baptist church or if you're part of a Presbyterian church, you understand that there's, over top of all that, there is a unity of those who are true believers, who would be part of, we could call either the Church of Jesus Christ or the body of Jesus Christ. Would be a way to refer to it.
So can I add?
Yep.
Yeah, can I add, it's also like the difference of like Protestant people who left the Catholic Church, right? They protest. That's how they got their name, Protestant, right? They protested the Catholic Church. Those are people that regard the Bible as the final authority of right and wrong, while the Roman Catholic Church is the Roman Catholic Church is above the Bible, and it's the man's doctrine. That is the final authority, their salvation, and everything. And those are two. So when you look at the wars, that's what the war. If you sum it up in one sentence, that's what it's about. The Protestant Church regards the Bible as the final authority, and the individual person, as they understand it by reading the Bible itself, versus the Roman Catholic Church it's the Pope or the hierarchy that
Because
is
they
the
have
final
authority.
authority. And
They were the authority of God
that's
on
the main
earth.
argument that
Yeah,
started
they
the
had
war.
built it, actually it started to crumble before the Crusades. It's already started to crumble a little bit, but that's what made, I think, the Pope more eager to start the Crusades, to try to get their power back and to crush the power. If you kill a lot of soldiers, then the nations are weakened, and the countries were starting to get powerful. If you want to get geopolitical, at this point, the nations were getting stronger, the church was getting weaker, because everybody followed and did what the church wants, because the church was the authority. They had, especially in the West, there was no king that had the authority that the Pope did. He could tell anywhere. He could tell somebody in a village in England somewhere, throw that guy in jail, and they had to go in jail.
Right.
Even if he was an emperor. But then as each nation started to grow, he started losing his power. By the time you get to 1200s here, where you got the Crusades, it's been 200 years of decline. About 1000 was the high point of the church. They're already in decline, and that's when then they stop caring, and you get the really bad popes who are just going off having some children and all that crazy stuff, because they're already in decline. Like, when you got the opulence and power, and nobody holds them account anymore, because they're not the ultimate authority, they just start doing crazy things. They're at the top, and nobody's holding them accountable. With power comes corruption, and they just became completely corrupt, in my opinion. But that doesn't mean that there aren't believers in there or people who are true. There's always people who God calls. If salvation is God calling and working with people and the Holy Spirit empowering people and changing lives, that happens whether or not there's an official authority or not. That happens in China. That happens in every country, even if they're resisted. I have one question. I'll go back.
You mentioned earlier pilgrimage. I'm just curious how this goes into the idea of merit and penance, because I have a big memory of priests giving people, like when they would go to confession, the priest would say, okay, now you have to do penance for this deed. And I have this vague memory that one of the things they were required to do on penance to atone for sin, to gain merit, was to go on pilgrimage. And so how do you think that really
Well,
affected
yes and no.
the desire to protect the Holy Land as a location of pilgrimage? Because it was affecting the people's merit by atoning for their sins.
I heard it's the action and with the penance was more the, what's the word? When you would, the words that coming into my head, they would do penitence attitude, but I don't think the actual pilgrimage for merit developed completely yet. It happened a bit with the Crusades, but it wasn't in full cycle. And they would receive merit by going to the holy locations. But that would be more of a mystical connection. That's how it was described. I was hearing something yesterday, and that's how they described it. It was not official, but it happened. And so yes, there would be the Melu idea of penance being used for that, but not necessarily enforced. I could be wrong, but that's how this one historian was describing it. It wasn't yet 100% you would get so many years off.
Of purgatory?
Yeah, purgatory. It was more, it would help your spiritual standing. And, yeah.
Well, not to let you go without a little bit of controversy. I'm just curious of your opinion on this question. I've been reading a lot in the 13th, 14th century in Europe, through the church, really conquering lands, discovering lands, South America, Portugal and Spain, in the name of the church, the Catholic Church. They subjugated people. I mean, it was pretty cruel in what they were doing with in the name of Christ and the flag. I have to see that flag after reading years and years and say, I wonder, we have the Great Commission before us, Christ and, other people that come into the church and see, do you think they associate that Christian flag with, some of these thoughts and memories of what Christ
Absolutely.
is all about through that flag? I mean, the Crusades the flag reminds me of the Crusades, the injustice that was done that way. What's your feeling about that?
It's absolutely, that was one of the reasons I've heard trying to separate ourselves in some ways, not from, you can't from events like that, but you have to build from ground zero, actually a negative position against you. An example would be in missions in northern Canada. I heard somebody railing against images in the church. When people put a Jesus on the front and they have Jesus on the cross or pictures of Jesus, they're always a white Jesus. Now, what if you're not white? And so they would say that image that people are giving is a white man's religion. And it's a religion of a certain thing. It's not my religion. And so the natives were resisting the gospel because Jesus wasn't for them. He's not their people. And it's because people were putting pictures of Jesus. It became the negative because there was a connotation that came with the conqueror, the colonial. But I actually read an article about some monks who got in real trouble in the Roman Catholic Church because they stopped the slave trade at one point by saying that all native peoples have souls and therefore cannot be treated as such. They were stopped, the slaves went home, and then they lost their power and they brought in more people to replace them. So there was resistance, especially early on, to even the slave trade within Spain.
I was just curious with, we have other folks coming to the church here now that are from Eastern and Jewish thing, and I wonder if that flag really connotates some of that
It
thinking.
can, yes.
I just
Because
concerned about it.
there is a history and the repercussions. Like, one of the things when I studied like Judaism is that Judaism is based, especially modern Judaism, is based around the Holocaust. You can't, unless you're willing to address the Holocaust, even people not born to the Holocaust, it has affected the psyche and the whole culture and history of the Jewish people. So I think the people of the Middle East is very much the same thing. They remember culturally what these things are, and these symbols can have repercussions, at least at first, the subconscious, but once you get through that, but it will create a negative.
Thanks, appreciate it.
That's what I was kind of saying, that's what suggesting it should be separated from what, like with, like the Roman
Yeah.
Church, when they conquered, right, when they figured out they could sail around and conquer land, and all the atrocities it did, then it shouldn't be blamed, that Christians shouldn't be blamed from what the Roman Church did. That's what I'm saying, it should be a separation there, because it's totally separate.
Well,
In
even
the
the Roman
theology
Catholic
and the
Church.
wars that we've had and the separating of the church, it's just saying it, because this way, like the Christian flag, I guess Christian, I wouldn't want to be blamed for something that the Roman Church did as association as being a Christian, because a Christian to me is just a Bible believer.
Well, you could say historically, the entire Huron nation converted to Christianity because of the missionaries of the Jesuit ministries, as a huge success. The problem is that the First Nations are not a peaceful people, and as soon as they became non-violent Christians, they were slaughtered by their enemies in the Summer of Blood.
Yeah, but
You don't hear about that history.
those
An
are-
entire nation of First Nations people, one of the largest nations, was slaughtered in an entire summer in genocide because they became Christian.
No, they became Roman Catholic. The Jesuits came in,
Well,
converted to
yeah,
Roman
but
Catholic, not Christian.
just think about it. If you're a person who you have thousands of years of warfare, and somebody comes up and says, this is how Christians are. They don't go to war. They put their trust in Jesus Christ, and then their enemy comes in and commits genocide, village by village, destroying an entire nation, and they didn't resist. That shows to be a pretty solid conversion, that they were trying to be like first century Christians and not resist. To me, that's a pretty good sign, because most people would fight back.
Yeah.
They chose not to. And as a First Nations, that's something you don't hear people talk about. But I think that's a pretty good about how the Roman Catholic Church, amidst all the other stuff that went on, there was a conversion and other bad stuff happened.
Yeah,
We can't blame
yeah,
them
I
for
would say there's
everything.
good things in the Roman Church. It's just,
We can't blame, we can look for the hard stuff, but there were huge successes as well.
yeah, there's some good things. It's complicated from the top. You know,
Yes, it's very complicated.
It uses the Bible. It's giving. It's not. It kind of went rogue kind of thing.
Yeah,
We got to bring it too close.
yeah, they're gonna come in. All right, so I'll end this here. Lord, we know that this topic of the Crusades is one, it's not something that we feel always a lot of pride in, though it's something that did happen, and we can also we can see that sometimes in the bad things, good can come from it, when you will, and sometimes when good things happen, bad can come from it, in our opinion and how it works out for us. But we know that you have always worked with your people, and you've always worked to bring about the redemption of people, of individuals as well as groups, to bring about salvation. And Lord, we can trust that even in the midst of all the bad that has happened, that even the people of your church have done, that you have been glorified. That there is good, because you are always bringing good. Lord, I pray that you would be with us, to remember that, or to be a people as we go forward into this week, as a people who look to see what you are doing in the world around us, and not just see the negative. We ask this in your Son's name.